Hello my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 tier listing guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today, in my ongoing series covering Baldur's Gate 3 itemization, we're continuing to talk about rings, and we're going to cover the Act 3 rings, including at least one of the most powerful items in the entire game. Rings are already an incredibly powerful item slot, as you've seen from Act 1 and Act 2, and the Act 3 rings do continue this trend, so get excited because we're going to talk about some pretty strong items. Before I begin, I do want to take a quick moment to say thank you so much to Michael Henderson for the $3 donation, Douglas Fugate for the $15, Patrick David Rayner for the $10 donation, so $30, and Stephen Thomas and Harrison Kenny for becoming channel members. Thank you so much, my friends. I really do appreciate the support. At this point, of course, you have seen the definitions of the tiers and how we are approaching rating these rings in previous tier lists, or if you're looking for those definitions, check part 1 of this rings tier list, and without any further ado, let's just get right into it and rate the Act 3 rings. We're starting with my Swedish metal band DJ Helm's hit single, After Death Do Us Part. The After Death Do Us Part ring gives you, when the wearer is down, so when you take lethal damage that brings you to 0 hit points, you come back to life with half of your hit points, but are afflicted by shadow possession. So you go to 0 hit points, once per long rest, you come back to life with half your hit points healed. This item seems, unfortunately, to be bugged in my testing. I actually had not equipped this item at all before I started making this tier list. I'd never used it in a playthrough or anything, so I went to test the item in-game. And what's supposed to happen is that you go to 0 hit points, come back with half of your health, and have the Shadow Possession condition applied to you. Shadow Possession being a curse that makes your character uncontrollable, forces them to attack the nearest creature, whether that be friend or foe, and have an additional 1d4 necrotic damage on all their attacks. So you get to come back to life once, but your character becomes uncontrollable and attacks everyone around them. What happened in my testing, and I tested this on multiple characters, both in and out of combat, I'm pretty confident that it's consistent, at least as of patch 7, was that the character would get downed, come back at half hit points, gain the Shadow Possession condition, and then immediately lose it, and so then be able to just act normally. So basically this just gives you, in its current implementation, it seems like this ring just gives you, when your character dies, they come back to life at, or not dies, goes to 0 hit points, they come back to life at half health, and then can just act normally. Obviously, that's stronger than the intended mechanic of the ring, and it's still possible that it works properly in some instances. I tried it in a couple different scenarios with a couple different characters to see if I could get it to work correctly, and couldn't, but if you are using this ring yourself, you may find a different result. And so it's a little bit difficult for me to judge how we should rate it, because obviously getting to control your character is a lot more powerful than not getting to control your character. If the ring is working as intended, going down to 0 hit points is already a fairly drastic thing to have happen, and then losing control of your character, having them attack the nearest creature, is not that much better than having them die or be bleeding out. In fact, in a lot of circumstances, it's worse, because you can't then use a healing potion or healing word to get them back into the fight on your side. The Shadow Possession is supposed to last until you use Remove Curse, or another way of removing Shadow Possession, so your character will be permanently uncontrollable until you bring them to 0 hit points again, or hit them with a Remove Curse effect, which obviously is very dangerous. There's still some uses for that effect if the ring was working as intended. It gives you a little bit more control of your ability. It gives you the ability to bring a character down to 0 hit points and have them get back up in some weird scenarios, like if you are in an area where the arena deals damage, so if they're going to die outside of combat, it can give you a way to bring them back. So you could maybe arrange to do something cool with this. And 1d4 extra necrotic damage is additional damage. The AI is much worse at controlling your characters than you are, but it would be kind of funny to throw a character at the enemies, deliberately bring them down to 0, and then have them come back with a buff where they can just attack the enemies because they'll be the nearest creatures. But for the most part, this would be a pretty weak effect if it actually worked as intended and took away your control of your character. As is, though, it's not terrible. Gaining an extra life definitely does give you a panic button if your character gets reduced to 0 hit points. I wouldn't recommend spending a whole ring slot on it, even so, because you would rather just have a ring that will keep you alive in the first place, or a ring that will help you kill enemies faster so you don't get reduced to 0 hit points. But if you have a particularly squishy character, then you will be able to make use of this. And it also has some pretty interesting use for solo play, because it does, if you are the only character in your party and you go to 0 with this equipped, it does prevent a game over. Your character comes back, loses Shadow Possession immediately, and you get to keep playing. So for a solo character, this does have some use. For party play, though, I'm going to give it C tier, even with the bug that makes it stronger than normal, just because it's a purely defensive item, and so I think that there are better options for that prevent you from dying in the first place, though it is a cool effect, and maybe there are some interesting things that you can do with this by deliberately having your character be reduced to 0 hit points. The Band of the Mystic Scoundrel. The Band of the Mystic Scoundrel gives you, whenever you hit a creature with a weapon, you can then cast an illusion or enchantment spell as a bonus action that turn. So you get a 1-turn buff that lets you cast illusion or enchantment spells as a bonus action. Illusion and enchantment spells include some of the strongest spells in the game, things like Hypnotic Pattern, Command, Hold Person. All of these fall under illusion or enchantment, and so you can take enemies out of the fight very easily with these spells. So the restriction on spell school is not significant. The Band of the Mystic Scoundrel, for a character that is both attacking and casting spells, effectively gives you permanent haste. You can both attack and cast a spell in the same turn, so you just get a whole extra action every turn. And the normal combination with this item is with the Helm of Arcane Acuity, because that gives you higher save DCs whenever you hit with a weapon attack, and then so you can make attacks with your main action. Stack Arcane Acuity, activate the Band of the Mystic Scoundrel, and then, as a bonus action, cast Command to lock down any enemies that are still surviving after your attacks. This is particularly powerful for Pact of the Blade Warlocks, Sword Bards, Paladins, characters that are both making attacks and casting spells. And so the Band of the Mystic Scoundrel gives your characters a massive benefit to their action economy at basically no cost for any character that's both making weapon attacks and casting spells. We probably don't need to go too much over how powerful this item is. I already said the words permanent haste, which should give you some sense of just how good it is, and the fact that it combines well with one of the other most powerful effects in the entire game, Arcane Acuity, makes this item even better, and it's a buff to some of what are already the most powerful types of characters in the game, hybrid melee attacker, or hybrid weapon users and spellcasters. Some minor additional synergy. Characters that like to do both of those also tend to be the best Illithid power users in the game, so you can have that character be great at using Illithid powers as well as being a spellcaster and a potent fighter. The Band of the Mystic Scoundrel can let you turn invisible if you want a more defensive option, or use offensive options to lock down enemies. There's all kinds of shenanigans that you can do with this ring, and tons of builds are built around maximizing it as much as possible. S tier for the Band of the Mystic Scoundrel, and you can certainly see this item featured in many of the most powerful builds on this channel, and various honor mode runs for just about every content creator on the planet has spent a whole bunch of time discussing this ring. The Burnished Ring. The Burnished Ring allows you to, once per long rest, cast Paralyzing Ray on an enemy. Paralyzing Ray makes the enemy make a Constitution save or become paralyzed for 2 turns. So it's effectively the same condition as Hold Person. It's the same as casting a level 2 Hold Person on them, but with a couple key differences. Firstly, they don't have to be a person. Paralyzing Ray can target anything, whether or not they're humanoid, so you can paralyze any enemy with Paralyzing Ray, even ones you couldn't normally target with Hold Person or even Hold Monster. It still works against Undead, which Hold Monster does not. And also, it's a Constitution saving throw. Hold Person is normally a wisdom save, and while Constitution is not typically a great save to target with most effects, if you're building around targeting Constitution, it's fairly easy to stack a bunch of penalties to enemy Constitution saves in order to make the Burnished Ring more likely to land. You can use Reverberation stacks, which give enemies penalties on their con saves up to -5, and you can give them disadvantage on their con saves by applying bleeding to them, which you can do without saving throws, using one of the grenades that applies bleeding. And so the Burnished Ring, you can actually get a pretty guaranteed Hold Person to land on any enemy who's susceptible to reverberation, bleeding, and paralysis. Some enemies are immune to some of those effects, of course, which is fairly interesting even at this late stage in the game. It also doesn't require your concentration, so you can paralyze one enemy for 2 turns while still concentrating on something else. So the Burnished Ring, despite being a once per long rest effect, is a powerful enough effect that I think it's actually relatively worth looking at. Would I build around this item myself? Probably not, because it's a lot of work to set up this effect. But it is a pretty powerful effect and worth setting up, I think. So if you want to put in the effort in order to land the Burnished Ring, you will be paid off by being able to paralyze certain very powerful enemies that you couldn't otherwise hit with a paralysis effect. For that reason, I'm going to give it B tier, because it's just really interesting that it has this non-concentration Hold Person that targets a different saving throw. I think that that's a cool and powerful effect, and one that's going to be worth looking at. Though, admittedly, it only works on 1 encounter per day, so the level of use you're going to get out of this is somewhat limited, but setting up for it can be pretty good. The Cryptlord Ring. The Cryptlord Ring allows you to cast Create Undead once per long rest. Create Undead is the 6th level wizard spell that lets you summon a mummy, so it's one of the 6th level summons that's sort of the capstone for summon-based characters. It's true that the mummy is the weakest of the 6th level summons. I think that it is worse than the summons available from Conjure Elemental by a lot, and worse than most of the planar allies, also by a pretty significant margin. But this is still a 6th level spell that you're getting for free once per long rest, which is always very interesting since that's such a rare and powerful resource. Summons in Baldur's Gate 3 are of course excellent, just having more bodies on the field is always good, and the mummy makes a pretty good damage source, especially if you can more reliably trigger fear on enemies, because it does additional damage to frightened enemies. But even without that, it does good damage, absorbs a decent amount of incoming damage, and overall is going to be a powerful addition to your combat arsenal. I think that the summon is supposed to despawn when you unequip this ring. I have seen it happen a couple times where it does, but most of the time it seems not to despawn when you unequip the ring. So I'm not actually sure what the intended behavior is for this item. But obviously if it doesn't even take a ring slot, then getting a 6th level spell slot completely for free is incredibly powerful. I'm going to judge this item as though you actually have to have the ring equipped in order to make use of it, because I think that's the intent, but this item does seem to be a little bugged with whether it lets the mummy stick around or not. Getting a 6th level spell slot once per long rest, that's great, and having a whole mummy companion in exchange for your ring slot is absolutely a worthy trade, even if the creature despawns when you unequip the Cryptlord Ring. There's also some special notability about this being created undead specifically. It's one of the few ways to get it other than it's the only way to get it other than actually taking 11 levels of wizard, because there's no scroll of Create Undead in the game, so you can't learn it or cast it from a scroll, but this lets you do that without having to actually have 11 wizard levels and still use high level summons in a multi-classed necromancer build, for example. And it works very well with other things that can power up undead, though, of course, because it's an undead, it's harder to heal and keep alive than other summons. The Cryptlord Ring is just a very powerful addition to any party's arsenal. A 6th level spell slot once per day is always good, and it's definitely worth keeping around. S tier for the Cryptlord Ring. The Djinni Ring. The Djinni Ring lets you cast Mage Hand once per short rest. Now, Mage Hand is a cantrip, so a once per short rest cast doesn't sound that exciting, but Mage Hand is itself limited to being cast only once per short rest, despite being a cantrip. So you actually do increase your longevity if you're a character that makes extensive use of Mage Hand. There are some characters that do that. Mage hands can be pretty useful, especially if you are a solo build, for example, because having the extra action to throw a bottle of water to set up the wet condition, to throw a healing potion at a downed character or something like that, can be extremely powerful for a party or especially for a solo character. Obviously, for a downed character, the mage hand won't help in solo play, but just having extra actions, even if they're relatively limited actions on the field, is super valuable. And for parties, having the mage hand be able to throw bottles of water or healing potions at allies is pretty powerful. This is fairly fiddly to set up in the late game, and while it does definitely increase the power level of your party, by this point you have so many options for action economy that the mage hand abuses are a little less important for most parties by this point in the game. But if you're doing a lot of shenanigans with Mage Hand, then the Djinni Ring actually does increase the longevity of your adventuring day by giving you uses of it in more combats per day. For that reason, I'm going to give it B tier, because I think that most parties are not going to build around this effect, but the ability to cast Mage Hand and throw bottles of water once per short rest is actually pretty powerful, and anything that gives you additional actions is good. So the Djinni Ring is still worth looking at, although I will say that in Act 3, this is definitely on the very lowest end of B tier. The Guild Ring. The Guild Ring is a quest item with no mechanical effect. It first shows up as an orange item, but then when you use it, it turns into a green item, and still appears as magical. The one funny thing about the Guild Ring is that if you spawn it in using the console in Act 1, then Gale can eat it, but otherwise the Guild Ring has no benefit at all. D tier for the Guild Ring. The Keepsake Ring. The Keepsake Ring allows you to cast Dominate Beast once per long rest. Dominate Beast is a level 4 spell slot, so a relatively valuable resource, but used in a very inefficient way. Dominate Beast is a pretty terrible spell. There's very few enemies that are actually targetable by it at all. And even if you do land it on an enemy, they have a chance to break the control every time they take damage. It takes your concentration, so it doesn't even necessarily win encounters that you face against beasts when you cast this spell. To add insult to injury, there's very few encounters with beasts at all in Act 3. And with the most likely playthrough order, the most dangerous one at the circus, you're very likely to have completed by the time you actually encounter this ring. Maybe if you went out of your way to get it early in some way, you could use it in the Chult Jungle, but for the most part, the Keepsake Ring is just never going to have a use, and even if you try to bring it into the only encounter where it might be impactful, Dominate Beast is just such a weak spell that I wouldn't recommend spending your actions on it. You just have better ways to take enemies out of the fight that will be more powerful overall, so D tier for the Keepsake Ring. The Orphic Ring. The Orphic Ring gives you a cast of Confusion once per long rest. The Confusion is a level 4 spell, but the Orphic Ring actually casts it at level 5, so with a 7-foot larger radius than the level 4 version of Confusion, because it gets upcast to level 5, so has a larger radius. Confusion is a pretty unreliable spell. In Baldur's Gate, it only has a 50% chance of stopping enemies from doing stuff. Otherwise, it defaults to them just attacking in very unpredictable and wild ways, which often include throwing explosives at your party and their party. And so Confusion, I think, in general, will not be as good at stopping enemies from doing stuff as you would want it to. Its main usage is that you can cast it in combat. It doesn't target allies, so you will be able to use Confusion if the combat is very mixed up and uncoordinated, and enemies and allies are all mixed up together. You can cast it to hit every enemy without targeting your allies. And so Confusion can be nice to have as a backup plan for particularly chaotic and messy engagements. But as a mainstay spell strategy, it's not something that you want. And since we don't want to have this ring equipped in advance in case the engagement puts itself in a position where you would want to use Confusion, I don't recommend equipping the Orphic Ring. Even though this is a high-level spell slot, it's just not going to come up in most combats, and because you have to have this equipped ahead of time, since it would otherwise take an action to equip it, the Orphic Ring is taking a whole ring slot for the potential expectation of using Confusion, which is a pretty situational spell, which I don't think is a good use of a very valuable resource in that gear slot. For that reason, I think that the Orphic Ring is pretty weak and not one that you would want in particular. Even if you know that there's an encounter coming up where you want this spell, Scrolls of Confusion are plentiful, so I just don't think the Orphic Ring really has a place, especially very late in the game when you get it. D tier. The Ring of Blink. The Ring of Blink lets you cast Blink once per long rest. Blink is a spell that gives you a 50% chance of vanishing at the end of each of your turns. You disappear completely, become uninteractable and untargetable by enemies, but also unable to take reactions or interact with the world in any other way. At the start of your next turn, you can then teleport up to 20 feet, and then when you do, you blink back into existence and can act normally. Blink is a spell I always think there's gotta be something cool we can do with this spell. It's a powerful effect. Being completely untargetable, of course, is very strong. And it's kind of unique in Baldur's Gate 3. But the fact that Blink is so unreliable, with only a 50% chance of activating each turn, makes it hard to use as a primary defensive tool, because you just can't rely on using it. Of course, one character becoming untargetable just means that enemies will target your other characters as well, and it can be hard to plan around that, because you don't get to choose whether your character gets Blunk or not, because it's just a 50% chance of activating. So it can be hard to position your party around having a character with Blink on them, since you don't know whether it's going to happen. Blink is an interesting defensive tool for solo play, because a character that doesn't exist half the time when you're solo is actually removing enemy turns from the equation. Basically, 50% of enemy turns don't exist because there's nothing for them to target. They might heal or do something else like that, but you actually are costing them action economy by blinking. So for solo play, it's a little more interesting, but for party play, Blink is a pretty weak spell. For that reason, I'm going to give this C tier, because I think there are some cool things you can do with it. It's certainly not a strategy that I would build around significantly, but if you do have a blinking character in solo play, for example, the Ring of Blink just gives you an extra cast of that, and will probably show up in that build. The Ring of Feywild Sparks. The Ring of Feywild Sparks gives you, while your Tides of Chaos is active, so if you are a wild magic sorcerer and you activate Tides of Chaos, you have a 100% chance of proccing wild magic, as opposed to the normal 50% chance while you have Tides of Chaos activated. Wild magic is generally an advantage for the player, so being able to guarantee activating wild magic is actually pretty good. Once you learn kind of the rules around positioning your character and your party to maximize the benefits of wild magic while minimizing the downsides, it's actually quite powerful for you. So being able to guarantee it is actually pretty nice as an effect. However, the real benefit of the Ring of Feywild Sparks is actually an unlisted bonus. It's not on the tooltip, but the Ring of Feywild Sparks gives you a +1 bonus to your spell save DCs, whether or not you're a wild magic sorcerer. A +1 bonus to your save DCs, you will notice that no other rings have provided that. And so this is a way to get a very powerful bonus from an item slot that doesn't otherwise provide it. And for that reason, the Ring of Feywild Sparks is just excellent on any spellcaster, because it gives you this bonus. It's not in the tooltip, but I have tested it recently and it hasn't been patched out in patch 7, so I'm assuming it's here to stay. And so the Ring of Feywild Sparks is just a best-in-slot item for any offensively focused spellcaster that wants to increase their spell save DCs. For wild magic sorcerers in particular, it's both flavorful and pretty cool, because being able to guarantee activating wild magic is awesome, but the real usage of this item is just increasing your save DCs, which, as we've discussed at extensive length during these item tier lists, is one of the most powerful effects an item can give you. S tier for the Ring of Feywild Sparks. The Ring of Regeneration. The Ring of Regeneration gives you 1d4 points of healing at the beginning of every turn in combat. It procs whether you're at full health or not, so it will always heal you for a d4, whether or not you've actually taken any damage. In and of itself, this isn't a massive bonus. 1d4 healing per turn over the course of late-game combats, which usually lasts 3 or fewer turns, even in particularly long combats, is not going to make the difference between success or failure. But the Ring of Regeneration is one of the most heavily synergistic items in the entire game, when you can pair it with other features that trigger off of healing. As an example, the Whispering Promise ring can bless you every time you proc the Ring of Regeneration. You get 2 turns of bless from it, so you'll have permanent bless if you combine those 2 rings. The Hellrider's Pride gloves don't let you cast Blade Ward on yourself with self-healing, but the Reviving Hands gloves do, so the Ring of Regeneration will now just provide permanent bless, permanent Blade Ward if you have those 2 items equipped. The Boots of Aid and Comfort can make that an additional 3 temporary hit points every turn. If you're a Life Cleric, that will add to the healing, so you get extra healing from this effect every turn. The Broodmother's Revenge Amulet gives you an additional poison damage every time the ring procs. So there's tons of items that work incredibly synergistically with the Ring of Regeneration. On top of that, it is, while most of the time the 1d4 hit points per turn won't matter, at base this is still a reasonable effect. For long combats, this can be a decent amount of healing. But the real benefit here is that you can use it to trigger items that trigger off of healing every single turn. You can also make yourself permanently immune to opportunity attacks with the chain shirt that disengages every time you get healed, whose name I'm blanking on right now. I think that's not like the strongest combination in the game, but it does let you run around the battlefield pretty well. But just the fact that the Ring of Regeneration basically gives you permanent bless and permanent Blade Ward on any character that's spec'd into the healing items already makes it a mainstay for those items. On top of that, of course, characters that multiply the efficiency of healing, things like barbarians that take half damage from everything, or characters with high damage reduction amounts like Abjuration Wizards can benefit even more from the Ring of Regeneration by multiplying the value of those restored hit points. But mostly this is a synergy item to proc those very, very powerful healing effects, and for those builds it's incredible. The Ring of Regeneration is S tier. It's going to go in any build that's using the Whispering Promise and the Reviving Hands, which a lot of builds late in the game are still going to be doing, and is going to power up those builds significantly by giving them the self buffs every single turn. The Ring of Truthfulness. The Ring of Truthfulness gives you advantage on insight checks. Advantage on insight checks is actually kind of nice because a lot of the insight checks in the game are hidden. You don't get to see the die roll made, and so you can't react to them with things like enhanceability or guidance. You have to know in advance that you're going to make an insight check. So just having permanent passive advantage on insight means that you're going to be making those rolls more successfully without having to worry about it. However, this is an item you get in Act 3, and by this point in the game, there aren't that many important insight checks left. There's a few that you'll be making, but not a ton. So the Ring of Truthfulness is a reasonably powerful effect that would be much better if you got it earlier in the game. Even so, it can be worth swapping this in for conversations, just if there are insight checks that you want to pass. I'm going to give it B tier, although I will say I think that's kind of generous because the actual mechanical effect of insight checks this late in the game isn't that high. But the Ring of Truthfulness does let you pass those, so if that's a goal for you, then this will be a pretty helpful item. The Seemingly Gleaming Ring. I have to say, I love the name of the Seemingly Gleaming Ring. It's just very fun to say. But the actual effect of the item is not as impressive as the nomenclature. The Seemingly Gleaming Ring is kind of a joke item. It gives you a +1 to your charisma saving throws and a -1 to your wisdom saving throws. And obviously wisdom is a much, much more important saving throw than charisma. In fact, I don't know if you make a single charisma save in all of Baldur's Gate. I can't think of one off the top of my head. Somebody, I'm sure, will think of one and mention it in the comments. But overall, the Seemingly Gleaming Ring is going to come up basically never, and having a -1 on your wisdom saves is a really strong penalty. If there was an F tier, if I had put an F tier in this tier list, this would go in it, because it's an item that actively makes your character worse to have equipped. But the Seemingly Gleaming Ring, obviously not useful to actually equip. Till Death Do Us Part. The Till Death Do Us Part ring allows you to cast Beacon of Hope, the level 3 cleric spell, once per long rest. A Beacon of Hope gives you advantage on wisdom saves, and makes all healing that you receive be maximized. So you always receive the maximum value of any healing that you would receive. So if you've got the Ring of Regeneration running, you get 4 hit points every turn while you have Beacon of Hope activated. Beacon of Hope is a pretty weak spell for a 3rd level spell, but a little more interesting when you get it for free. The main usage here is the advantage on wisdom saves. In Act 3, there are some enemies who make you make very dangerous wisdom saving throws, and having advantage on those can be pretty powerful. That being said, there's a much more powerful way to give your whole party advantage on wisdom saves, and that's Hero's Feast. This being an Act 3 item means you should have access to Hero's Feast by this point, or at least many parties will. And I recommend for honor mode runs that you structure your party in such a way that you can get Hero's Feast. Of course, anyone can access this by using camp casters, but any party that has a druid or cleric in it will want to be running Hero's Feast because it's such a powerful effect. So even if you don't use camp casters, you'll often have advantage on wisdom saves all of the time, regardless of whether you have to spend your concentration and the charge of this ring on it. That being said, for a party that doesn't have Hero's Feast, advantage on wisdom saves is still a pretty valuable effect, and if you are going into a fight where you know enemies are going to be making you make a lot of wisdom saves, then casting Beacon of Hope and having it be one of your character's concentrations for that fight can be pretty useful. This, of course, is nice because it doesn't have to replace a valuable cleric concentration slot the way it would if you actually cast it as a spell. Instead, you can have any other character be concentrating on it, and so you can have advantage on wisdom saves be provided by your fighter, compared to having to have your cleric give up Spirit Guardians or something in order to have this effect. For that reason, I'm going to say that this is a C-tier item. It's an effect that you might use in some encounters, with specific compositions, and so it's a C-tier item that is worth paying attention to if your party fits that very specific criteria. Although even then, it's only going to be useful in some pretty narrow encounters where you're making a lot of wisdom saves and where you aren't disabling or killing the enemies before you have to do that. But for those parties, it can be a pretty useful item. So, to sum up the rings at the end of Act 3, in rough order of priority. If you have a build that's built around using it, of course you will have the Band of the Mystic Scoundrel equipped. It's the most powerful effect on this list by far. Almost every party is going to want to be using the Strange Conduit Ring, the Callous Glow Ring, the Risky Ring, and the Shadow Cloaked Ring, because those all increase your damage output dramatically without requiring much from your party in return. So basically every party can make use of those items. If you have any offensive spellcaster, the Ring of Feywild Sparks is going to show up, and if you have a healing-focused character in your party, you're going to be using the Whispering Promise and the Ring of Regeneration. The Coruscation Ring will fill things out if you have a Radiating Orb character, and the Ring of Protection likely goes on whatever character doesn't need another item slot available, with the Crypt Lord Ring also similarly filling a gap in your equipment. More specifically focused characters may want to be using the Eversight Ring, the Killer's Sweetheart, or the Ring of Spiteful Thunder instead, but the S-tier rings at the end of Act 3, a lot of them have powerful passive benefits that go in every party, so it's very hard to go wrong picking items from the Act 2 and 3 S-tier rings. Alright, my friends, I hope that you have enjoyed this look at every ring in Baldur's Gate 3. Having finished rating these items, we've now covered every single piece of equipment in the game. Obviously other than weapons, but every equipable item, protective equipment, or armor I have now talked about in extensive detail, which is pretty wild to think about. I will probably do some kind of grand summary video to talk about the best items overall. Maybe I'll do like top 25 in each act or something like that, or I'll figure out exactly how that's going to look sometime over the next week or so. But I hope that you enjoyed this look at all the rings and all of the items in general. And of course, if you think there is something that I should move around, or if you think that I misunderstood one of the items in a particularly egregious way, definitely let me know in the comments. I'm very open to making changes if you have a good argument as to why something should be in a different position on this list. The lesson from rings, I think overall, is that they provide tons of extremely powerful, easy-to-use benefits, and so you should really be looking to build your characters to maximize the value of these items. And I hope that this provides you with the tools to do so. As always, of course, if you have enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a comment and hit like. Helps me out a ton with the algorithm when people interact with the video. So I appreciate you taking the time to do that. And of course, you can subscribe to my channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 analysis and other strategy game content. Cheers, my friends. I'll catch you next time.